So in this video, I'm going to answer a question that somebody asked me the other day on my channel on another video about liens and foreclosures. And the question is, besides tax liens, will I have to pay for any other liens? For example, I'm looking at this property that has HOA liens, hospital liens, contractor liens, etc. Will I have to pay to take care of this as well, or the plaintiff has to do it before selling it? Is this included in the final judgment? Okay, great question. So in Florida, the responsibility for paying liens on a foreclosed property depends on the type of lien and how it is addressed during the foreclosure process. So the first thing you need to understand is about final judgments and liens. In Florida foreclosure proceedings, only liens named and addressed in the final judgment of foreclosure are extinguished. And this is very important. That means the second mortgage, the line of credit, the contractor liens, they all have to be named in the final judgment. That's really important. Now, let me go ahead and stop right there and explain, because I'm going to show you an example. You cannot go by that entirely. You can't base your decision when you see something like a second mortgage or an equity line of credit that's named in the foreclosure. You can't automatically assume that that's going to be wiped out and there's going to be no responsibility, to repay that. Let me show you an example. So here's an example of one that I'm working on right now. This is your final judgment summary, and hopefully you've watched my other video about final judgments, but this is the most important document that you're looking for from an investor standpoint. It's going to tell you what the bank had in it, what was the mortgage, the interest, penalties. What you're looking for is, in the very first beginning page, is basically you're going to see the plaintiff, which is BOA, that's your bank, and all the defendants. That's where you're going to find the owner's name and any other mortgages or liens on the property that they find. So Goodleap LLC is named, and the HOA Homeowners Association is both named as defendants in this final judgment. Most people are going to think that this Goodleap LLC is going to be wiped out or nullified, once the foreclosure goes through because they're named here. But that's not necessarily the case. This document right here is how the plaintiff knows to name this company in the final judgment, because they filed a Uniform Commercial Code financing statement, which we refer to as a UCC. So the bank knows that they have financial interest in the property, so they're named. So here's the issue, and it's all how the title company plans on writing the title policy. They will give an owner's title policy on this property, but with an exception to this Goodleap LLC. So it would be an exception on the title policy, leaving this Goodleap open to come back on whoever owns the property. And if it's enough money, they probably would. So the only way they're going to pass perfectly clear title without an exception for this is if this is paid in full. So the bank is going to have to pay this in full to pass clear title, or they're going to have to somehow talk a buyer into taking it with this exception. I doubt even a mortgage company would allow that on the title policy. So the only option the seller has is to pay this off before they close on the property. So this is the email that I received from the title company concerning this UCC. The notice of commencement can be considered expired since they expire 1 year from the date of recording, and there is no other date specified on the notice. As for the UCC, it is junior to the foreclosed mortgage, and Goodleap did receive notice of the foreclosure. The below is the process that we follow for UCCs. In this case, since Goodleap was notified of the foreclosure, the UCC can remain an exception to title. If we don't think a buyer would be agreeable to that, we'll need to get a payoff and get the UCC paid in full. I hope that makes sense, because the biggest thing I want you to get out of this is that just know that you cannot go into it thinking it's guaranteed that anything that's named as a defendant in the foreclosure process is going to be wiped out or nullified. That's just not the case. So next I'm going to talk about specific liens, and we're going to start out with the most important, tax liens. Now, tax liens take priority over all other liens and must be satisfied regardless of the foreclosure process. They remain attached to the property and are not eliminated by foreclosure. The buyer at foreclosure sale assumes responsibility for settling any outstanding tax liens. Now, let me point out one quick thing. Generally, it's not going to be property taxes that are the problem, because if there's a mortgage involved, the property taxes are going to be paid. Normally, what you're going to see is federal income tax liens on the homeowner himself, and those are a whole different ballgame. Okay, number 2, HOA liens. Homeowners Association liens, or HOA liens, often survive foreclosure, but their status depends on the specifics of the foreclosure. In many cases, the buyer is responsible for unpaid HOA dues after the foreclosure sale. Now in Florida law, the safe harbor provision may limit a buyer's liability to 12 months of unpaid dues or 1% of the original mortgage debt, whichever is less. But this only applies to properties foreclosed by the first mortgage lender. So the example I showed you earlier, that's exactly what situation we're in. Safe harbor laws apply. So they're only going to pay, even though there's a lien on the property, they're only going to pay the past 12 months or 1% of the original debt amount, whichever is less. So here's one you're going to see more often than not: contractor liens or mechanic liens. Mechanic liens are subordinate to the mortgage lien being foreclosed unless the contractor filed the lien before the mortgage or has specific priority rights. If the foreclosure judgment explicitly addresses these liens, they may be extinguished. Otherwise, you can inherit responsibility to pay them off. And we had one of these, an example that I showed you in the property that I'm working on now, with the actual contractor that installed these solar panels. Let me give you another example, and I mentioned this in my other video about foreclosures and liens, and this actually happened to me. Back when I built my house with a custom builder over 20 years ago, it was common practice for the concrete companies that were pouring the slab to immediately put a mechanic's lien against the property. Once they got paid by the builder, they would remove it. Well, let's go down the road several years when I refinanced my house, and lo and behold, when they did the title work, that had never been satisfied. So the title company had to go back to the concrete company to have them record a satisfaction so I could have clear title so I could refinance my property. So that's just another example of what happens, but you're going to see, dealing with foreclosures, you're going to see mechanic liens on properties a lot. Okay, next, hospital and medical liens. Now, you're not going to see these very often, but these liens may not automatically be extinguished by foreclosure unless explicitly addressed in the foreclosure judgment. They're usually subordinate to the mortgage lien. You need to make sure and check the court records and the title report to confirm whether these liens remain or not. Before I wrap this video up, I want to talk about one more quick thing, and that's dealing with buying a property post-foreclosure. Once the bank gets the property back through the foreclosure process and they have the deed and they're selling it on the open market. If the plaintiff, aka the lender, is selling the property post-foreclosure, they may pay off certain liens before transferring the title to make the property marketable, but this is not guaranteed unless specifically stated in the sales terms. So this is an example of an actual seller addendum. Now this is bank owned after the foreclosure. Just about any foreclosure that you buy on the open market is going to have their own seller addendums, and they're going to spell out about everything possible to do with a transaction. And remember, their addendums are always going to supersede your local and state contracts. This section talks specifically about defects in title, and I'm not going to read this. You can stop the video and read over it, which I suggest you do just to see a good example. But basically what it says, if the seller cannot pass marketable title, then both the seller and the buyer have the right to terminate the contract, and the buyer's earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. But it also says that the seller can terminate the contract at any time. If they're unable to fix the title in a timely manner, normally they're going to do is cancel the contract. They're going to take it off the market and get the issues fixed, then put it back on the market. This happens all the time, and I know there's a lot of really pissed off buyers because this happens, and you think, why didn't they fix this before they put it on the market? Honestly, most corporate sellers don't do it that way. They put it on the market, then find out this stuff after the fact, which is very, very aggravating. Well, that'll do it for this video. I want to give you one piece of advice before we wrap this up. If you're buying properties at the courthouse steps, or you plan on trying to buy properties at the foreclosure auction, you need to be getting a title search done. If not, sooner or later, you're going to get caught with your pants down. And you're either going to inherit something that you're going to be forced to pay off to sell the property, or you're going to end up having to hire an attorney to fight for you to get that off the title. Either one is a losing proposition and going to cost money. Spend the money up front and get a title search. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do. As always, I really appreciate it. And if you're an investor, buyer, seller, or a real estate agent out there and you need some counseling or some advice, or you want to ask some questions, hey, just hit me up. I'll be glad to help. As always, thanks and have a great day.